Sometimes the biggest stories start in the smallest places. This is one of those. It's about how a single seed of faith, carried all the way across an ocean, found a home in a little Korean riverside town and grew into something truly historic. Let's trace that incredible journey together. Our guide for this story is Pastor James Huang. Now, Pastor Huang served as a missionary to China, and today he's ministering in Maryland, but he's also a passionate researcher of Korean mission history. We're going to be sharing stories from his incredible book, Remember and Repay, 52-Week Mission Meditation, each week. And this right here, this is the mission history story for the second week of February. All right, so our story kicks off not in some grand, ornate cathedral, but in a simple, humble home, where a really historic church was just about to be born. Okay, so picture this. The date is Sunday, February 9th, 1896. We're in a small riverside town called Gangyang, inside the home of a local man, Mr. Ji Byung-suk. And gathered there are missionary Pauling, his wife, and another missionary, Gadarin. They're just holding a simple Sunday service. But that service, that was the moment the very first Baptist church in all of Korean history was founded. Just like that. That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, Gangyang wasn't a major capital city or anything. So why there, and why these specific people? Well, the answer involves a journey that started thousands of miles away and a whole series of, you could say, fateful connections. To really get how this all happened, we've got to trace the incredible journey of the man who led that very first service, Missionary Pauling. So Pauling's path to that day was just a whirlwind. He first lands in Korea in May of 1894. He pops back to Japan for a bit, then marries Marvel Hall in Yokohama on Valentine's Day of all days in 1895. But here's the real turning point. That spring, he comes back to Korea. He meets a cloth merchant named Ji Byung-suk. Pauling shares his faith and eventually baptizes him. And believe it or not, less than a year later, they're holding that very first church service, right there in Ji's home. Okay, so we've connected the dots on how Pauling met the man who'd host the first church. But what was it that lit a fire in him to travel halfway across the world to Korea at all? For that answer, we need to bring another key player into our story. Turns out the inspiration for Pauling's mission wasn't even his own idea. Not at first. It was actually sparked by the incredible passion of another pioneer, a Canadian independent missionary. Let me introduce you to Malcolm Fenwick. This guy was the real deal. He arrived in Korea way back in 1889, and he didn't just visit. He dove right in, immersing himself in the culture, wrestling with the language, and just patiently laying the groundwork for a mission he couldn't even fully see yet. But Fenwick just knew he couldn't do it all by himself. After 4 years in Korea, he realized he needed two big things: to be officially ordained as a pastor, and, just as important, he needed money and more people to join the cause. So, in 1893, he gets on a boat and sails back to the United States with a very clear mission in mind. And this is where the story just blows up, in the best way possible. Fenwick's trip to Boston wasn't just about fundraising. It set off this unbelievable chain reaction that turned one man's vision into a full-blown international effort. See, Fenwick had one person he absolutely had to meet: Pastor A.J. Gordon. Gordon was a huge deal in Boston. He was the pastor of the very influential Clarendon Street Baptist Church. He founded a missionary training school, and get this, he even composed the famous hymn, My Jesus, I Love Thee. Fenwick had been totally inspired by him at a conference years before, so Gordon was the guy to see. So Fenwick actually enrolls in Gordon's training school, and he quickly becomes the #1 advocate for Korea. He's telling stories, he's talking about the people, the culture, the need. And his passion, wow, it was absolutely infectious. He completely captivated Pastor Gordon and the other students, including, you guessed it, a young man named Pauling. And just like that, you see this perfect domino effect. It's an amazing chain of support. First, Fenwick's stories light a fire under Pastor Gordon. Second, Gordon's school gives guys like Pauling the training they need. Third, a special fund gets created to provide the money. And fourth, that fund sends out its very first missionaries, Pauline and Gadarin, straight to Korea. On the story behind that funding, it's incredibly moving. It was called the Ella Thing Memorial Mission. A deacon at Gordon's church had lost his only daughter, Ella, when she was very young. So he took her entire inheritance and donated it to create this mission fund. Her legacy, her family's unbelievable sacrifice, that's what paid for Pauling's journey across the ocean. So, fueled by this amazing story of connection and sacrifice, the mission grew. And by 1897, the congregation was big enough to build its own dedicated church. But the way that church was designed, well, that holds a really unique story of its own, and it's one that's often misunderstood. Okay, so here's the thing. You might hear people say that the Gyeongyang Church was the third Protestant church building ever built in Korea, but that's not quite right. The actual fact is that it was the third Gyeokja, or G-shaped church building in Korea. And that little distinction? It's a really important historical and cultural detail. So what in the world is a Gyeok-shaped church? Well, the shape comes from the Korean letter Gyeok, which looks just like an L. And this was a totally brilliant architectural solution to a cultural challenge. Back in late 19th century Korea, social customs were very strict about separating men and women in public. The L-shaped building let the pastors stand at the corner and see both the men on one side and the women on the other, all without them having to break that important tradition. Pretty smart, right? So when you look at it in its proper architectural context, it all makes sense. You see, the Dongdaemun Church was built in this style in 1892. Then came the Sorye Church in 1895. And that makes the Gyeongyang Baptist Church, built in 1897, the third church to use this really unique, culturally sensitive design. So the crucial point is this. The legacy of this church isn't just about being first or third or whatever number on a list. It's about a much bigger story of international partnership, of profound personal sacrifice, and of a really thoughtful engagement with local culture that was literally built into the walls of the church itself. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? You know, from Fenwick inspiring Gordon in a classroom to Pauling meeting Ji Byung-sok on a riverbank. How many of history's really great achievements begin with just a single quiet connection between two people?